Mark Sterling kissed his mistress goodbye at 5:47 in the morning, straightened his $5,000 tie in the rearview mirror, and laughed, actually laughed at the thought of his wife still asleep in their mansion, oblivious, patient, grateful for whatever scraps of life he allowed her to have. He had spent the night in Jessica's arms without a single moment of guilt because men like Mark Sterling did not feel guilt. They felt entitled. And that single arrogant laugh, echoing inside his $60,000 car on a quiet Greenwich morning, was the last truly free sound he would ever make. If you are new here, please subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and follow this story all the way to the end because I promise you, you have never seen a fall quite like this one. And drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from right now. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The drive from Jessica's downtown apartment back to the Sterling estate in Greenwich took exactly 31 minutes on a clear morning. Mark knew because he had made the drive dozens of times. He had it timed, measured, calculated the way he calculated everything in his life. Leave by 5:30, arrive before Elena woke at 6:15, shower in the guest bathroom, change into fresh clothes he kept folded in his office closet, and be seated at the kitchen island with a cup of coffee by the time his wife padded downstairs in her robe. It was a system, and Mark Sterling trusted his systems. He turned the radio to a classical station, not because he loved classical music, but because it made him feel like the kind of man he believed he was. Sophisticated, measured, in control. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel and thought about the Hargrove account he was closing next week, a $200 million commercial development that would cement his position as CFO of Whitmore Architecture Group for another decade at minimum. He thought about the bonus. He thought about the new watch he was going to buy himself as a reward. He did not think about Elena. He almost never did anymore. The iron gates of the estate opened automatically as his car approached sensors, reading the chip embedded in the vehicle's front bumper. He pulled up the long private drive lined with oak trees parked in front of the main entrance and sat for a moment in the silence of the car. 6:04 in the morning. He was early, actually. Good. He could shower and be at the kitchen table before she even came downstairs. She would never know. She never knew. He climbed out of the car, stretched his shoulders, breathed in the cool September air, and walked toward the front door with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned everything around him. The door opened smoothly. The alarm did not chime its usual three-tone greeting. He paused. He always forgot to disable it himself, and Elena always had it set. He stepped inside and waited for the sound. Nothing. He frowned just slightly, then shrugged. Maybe she had already disarmed it when she came downstairs. Maybe she was already in the kitchen. "Elena?" he called, not warmly, not with anticipation, just the automatic sound a man makes when he expects a response from a room. Nothing. The house was quiet, in a way that was different from the ordinary quiet of early morning. It was not the silence of sleep. It was the silence of absence. He noticed it the way you notice a sound that has stopped, not immediately, but in the moment when your brain registers the gap. He walked down the main hallway toward the kitchen. The lights were off. The coffee maker was cold. There was no smell of breakfast, no hum of the morning news from the small television Elena kept on the counter, no sound of her slippers on the hardwood floor. The kitchen was empty. And on the center island, the wide white marble slab where Elena laid out their morning meals with the kind of quiet, careful precision that he had long since stopped noticing or appreciating. There was nothing. Nothing except one thing. A sealed white envelope. His name was written on the front in Elena's handwriting. Not her usual hurried scrawl for grocery lists or reminder notes. This was deliberate. Each letter formed with slow, intentional elegance, as if she had taken her time, as if she had wanted him to know that her hand had been completely steady when she wrote it. Mark Sterling stared at that envelope for a long moment. And for the first time in a very long time, something moved in his chest that was not arrogance or desire or calculation. It was unease. He picked it up. It was heavier than a simple note. He could feel multiple layers of paper inside. He set it back down, almost as if not opening it would keep whatever was inside from being real. He looked around the kitchen again, opened the refrigerator out of pure reflex. It was fully stocked, organized, untouched. He walked to the base of the stairs and looked up. "Elena," he called again, louder this time. Silence. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, something coiling in his gut now that he could not name. He pushed open the door to their bedroom. The bed was perfectly made, the kind of tight flat surface that looked like no one had slept in it, or like someone had made it with deliberate finality, the way you make a bed in a hotel room when you are checking out. He crossed to her walk-in closet and opened the door. The rods were half empty. Not chaotically empty, not stripped in anger or haste, methodically empty. Her formal wear was gone. Her everyday pieces were gone. The shelf where she kept her jewelry boxes gone. The row of shoes she had arranged by color and occasion, reduced to a handful of older pairs she rarely wore. What remained looked like the deliberate leftovers of a woman who had chosen very carefully what she no longer needed. Mark stood in the door of that closet for nearly 10 full seconds, which was the longest he had been still without thinking in years. Then he walked back downstairs, sat on one of the kitchen stools, picked up the envelope, and opened it. Inside were 3 separate documents, paper clipped together with a neat silver clip. The first was a divorce filing. Formal, complete, signed and dated 6 days ago. His eyes moved across the legal language with the speed of a man trained to process financial documents. Irreconcilable differences. Distribution of marital assets. The law firm's name was printed at the top of the page in clean block letters, Harwick, Callaway and Associates. Mark knew that name. Every person in his world who dealt with money above a certain threshold knew that name. Harwick, Callaway and Associates did not handle ordinary divorces. They handled the kind of divorces where the assets involved required forensic accountants and international legal coordination. They were by every measure in his industry the best and most feared family law firm in the northeastern United States. His jaw tightened. He flipped to the second document. Photographs. He did not need to look at all of them to understand what they were. The first image was enough. He and Jessica outside her apartment building 3 weeks ago, his hand on the small of her back, her laughing up at him. The timestamp in the corner was precise down to the second. The second photograph was from inside a restaurant. He did not know how anyone had gotten that angle. The third was from a parking garage. Professional work. Detailed, dated, sequenced. Not the work of a suspicious wife with a cell phone. This was the work of someone who had been hired, briefed, and given time to build a case. His face had gone very still now. He set the photographs down and looked at the third document. It was a financial summary. 2 pages. Annotated in the margins in a neat hand he did not recognize, probably a paralegal. His personal accounts, joint accounts, business expense reports, and a section near the bottom that made him read the same paragraph 3 times before his brain accepted what his eyes were seeing. Evidence of account irregularities, transfers, dates, account numbers. A trail that laid out this clearly on paper looked very much like what it was. Mark set the papers down on the counter very slowly, as if they might shatter. He sat for a moment. Then he did what powerful men do when they feel the first tremor beneath their feet. He reached for his phone and called his lawyer. The phone rang 4 times. Then Richard Holt's groggy voice answered. "Mark, it's 6 in the morning." "Elena left," Mark said. His voice was flat, controlled. A man rerouting. A pause on the other end. "What do you mean, left?" "I mean she filed for divorce. Harwick Callaway." A much longer pause. "Harwick and Callaway?" "Yes." "Mark, I know who they are, Richard." "Then you know this is not—" Richard stopped himself. Mark could hear him sitting up in bed, coming awake with the sharp clarity of a lawyer who understood what those 3 words meant at 6 in the morning. "Okay, don't touch anything. Don't move any money. Don't make any calls except to me. I'll be at your house by 9. "She has photographs," Mark said. Another pause. Longer this time. "Of what specifically?" "Of Jessica and me. Multiple occasions." He heard Richard exhale slowly. Not the exhale of a man who was surprised. The exhale of a man managing his own reaction. "All right. 9 o'clock, Mark. Do not do anything before I arrive. Can you do that?" Mark said he could. He hung up. He sat with his hands flat on the marble countertop and stared at the space where Elena's coffee mug usually sat each morning. The white mug with the small painted blue flower that she had bought at a craft fair in Vermont 4 years ago, a trip he had canceled on, and she had taken alone. The mug was gone. He picked up his phone again and called Elena. The number rang once, then went to voicemail. Her voice, calm, clear, unhurried, said she was unavailable and would return calls when convenient. He called again. Voicemail. He called a third time. This time it did not even ring. The call ended immediately. She had declined it manually. She was awake somewhere holding her phone, watching his name appear on the screen, and pressing the button to send him to voicemail with the same deliberate calm with which she had written his name on that envelope. Mark Sterling set his phone on the counter and felt something he had not felt since he was a boy standing in the principal's office with no explanation that would hold. He felt caught. He got up from the stool and walked back upstairs to the guest bathroom. He turned on the shower, stripped out of the clothes he had worn to Jessica's apartment, and stood under the hot water for longer than necessary. His mind worked the way it always worked, sorting, prioritizing, calculating. Elena had lawyers. Fine. He had lawyers. She had photographs. He had resources to challenge the circumstances of how those photographs were obtained. She had filed first, which was a disadvantage for him, but not insurmountable. He would counterfile. He would slow the process down. He would negotiate. He was Mark Sterling. He had closed deals in worse conditions than this. He turned off the water, dried himself with brisk efficiency, and walked to his closet to change. He dressed in his sharpest clothes deliberately, not because he was going anywhere yet, but because powerful men do not meet crisis in yesterday's clothes. He was buttoning his cuffs when his personal cell phone rang. Not his business line, his personal number. The name on the screen was Daniel Whitmore, his business partner, co-founder of Whitmore Architecture Group. Mark answered with the automatic smooth professionalism of a man who had spent 20 years performing competence. Daniel, calling early. Mark. Daniel's voice was not its usual hearty executive warmth. It was careful, measured. The voice of a man who had thought about what to say before dialing. We need to talk. Of course. I was planning to come in later today. There's something on the personal front. It's not about the personal front, Daniel said. Well, it is, but it's also about the company. Mark's hand, still holding the cuff button, went still. I need you to explain to me, Daniel said slowly, how it is that your wife, Mark, currently holds 53% of this company's voting shares. The cuff button fell from his fingers and clicked against the hardwood floor. He did not hear it. What did you just say? His voice had dropped half a register without his permission. Elena Sterling, Daniel said. And there was something underneath his voice now that Mark would later identify as controlled fury, was listed as a silent partner in the original corporate structure that you and I set up 12 years ago. I knew that. What I did not know, what apparently none of us on the board knew, including me, is that over the past 8 years, Elena has been quietly acquiring shares. Through 2 separate holding companies that until this morning, nobody on our team had successfully connected to her name. Mark's entire body went cold. She called the board chair at 5 o'clock this morning, Daniel continued. The board chair, Mark, before most of us were even awake. She has majority control. She requested an emergency board meeting for this afternoon, and she has brought Harwick Calloway in to represent her corporate interests as well as her personal ones. The silence that followed lasted for 5 full seconds. In Mark's professional life, 5 seconds of silence on a business call was an eternity. That's impossible, Mark said, and even as the words left his mouth, he heard how hollow they sounded. Not impossible, improbable to anyone who had underestimated Elena, but not impossible. I've had our legal team reviewing the share acquisition records for the past hour, Daniel said. It's clean, Mark. Every purchase was legal. Every transfer was documented. She has been incredibly patient and incredibly methodical, and she has done nothing that can be challenged. He paused. I need to know what is happening. I need to know what you have done. I haven't done anything that... Don't. Daniel's voice sharpened into something that cut the sentence clean. Do not tell me a story right now. I am sitting here with our board chair and 2 corporate attorneys, and we are all looking at the same documents, and none of us are happy. You will be at that board meeting this afternoon, and you will have answers, or this conversation will take a very different direction. Daniel ended the call. Mark stood in the middle of his closet, surrounded by his expensive suits and the lingering scent of cedar and money. And for one strange, vertiginous moment, he could not remember which direction the door was. He shook it off. He was not a man who fell apart. He was a man who adapted. He called Jessica. The phone rang 6 times. Then her voice, different from its usual playful warmth, guarded. "Mark, why are you calling this early? I need to tell you something," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Elena has filed for divorce. There may be some complications with the company over the next few weeks. It's nothing that can't be managed, but I want you to know what's happening." A pause. "Complications? How?" "Temporary," he said, and his voice carried the certainty he had always been able to produce on demand. "A legal process that will resolve quickly. I have attorneys. In a few months this is over and we move forward." "A few months," Jessica repeated. "Yes." Another pause, longer this time. "Mark, are your cards working right now?" Something flattened in his chest. "What?" "I tried to use the supplemental card you gave me this morning," she said, and her voice had shifted into something businesslike and precise that he had never heard from her before. "For groceries. It was declined." He felt the first wave of real nausea. "That's a bank error. I'll have it sorted by—" "It wasn't a bank error," she said quietly. "I called the bank. The account it was linked to has been frozen by court order." The silence between them had a different texture now. "I see," Mark said. "I think Jessica said with a kind of careful neutrality that was worse than anger that we should probably take a little space while you handle this. This is clearly a very complicated situation, and I don't want to be in the middle of it." "Jessica, I'll be in touch," she said, and ended the call. Mark stared at his phone. In the span of 40 minutes, he had lost his wife, his business control, his credit access, and his mistress. He was sitting in a multi-million-dollar mansion that he could no longer be certain was fully his. He was wearing a suit that projected power he could no longer be certain he held. He went back downstairs, picked the 3 documents off the kitchen counter where he had left them, and sat at the kitchen table to read them again. More carefully this time. More slowly. Not the skimming of a confident man looking for easy answers, but the careful rereading of someone who was beginning to understand they had been walking confidently through a room that had been quietly rearranging itself around them for a very long time. The divorce filing had been prepared with extraordinary care. Every asset was listed. Every property, every account, every investment vehicle. The level of detail was not the work of a woman who had spent 3 weeks gathering records in a panic. This was years of quiet documentation. Elena had not reacted to being betrayed. She had prepared for the moment when she would respond. He turned to the financial summary again and forced himself to look at the annotated section near the bottom. The transfer records. His hands were completely still on the paper now. He read it with the eyes of a man who had spent 20 years in corporate finance, and what he saw was exactly what any trained eye would see. A paper trail. Not a complicated one, not a carefully hidden one. A trail that, if followed, led clearly from company accounts to personal ones, from legitimate expense categories to ones that would not survive a forensic audit. He had been careful, but he had not been careful enough. Or rather, he had been careful in the ways that protect you from amateur scrutiny, and not careful enough for the kind of scrutiny that came with the resources of Harwick Callaway and Associates. He set the papers down. His lawyer was coming at 9. The board meeting was this afternoon. He needed to think clearly. He needed to build a response, a strategy, a counteroffer that would neutralize each of these elements one at a time. But even as his mind began its familiar mechanical process, sort, prioritize, calculate, some quieter part of him, some instinctive part that lived beneath all the performance and the arrogance, sent up a single terrible signal. She had been ahead of him, every step. Every document, every photograph, every share acquisition, every legal motion, all of it completed before he walked through that front door this morning. He had come home believing he was returning to a life he controlled, and Elena had already left the building. Not in a rage, not in tears, not with confrontation or accusation or the kind of desperate emotional scene he had always privately feared and been prepared to manage. She had simply quietly, completely disappeared from his life. And in disappearing, she had taken everything with her that he had not realized he could not afford to lose. Mark Sterling sat alone in his kitchen as the September morning brightened around him and felt the specific particular horror of a man who has been outsmarted by someone he never took seriously enough to watch. He had thought she was quiet because she was weak. He had thought her patience was submission. He had thought her stillness was acceptance. He had been wrong about all of it. He picked up his phone one more time and tried her number. It did not even ring this time. Straight to voicemail. Her voice unhurried and clear, unavailable. He set the phone down on the marble counter and looked at the empty space where her coffee mug used to sit, and understood for the very first time that the woman he had dismissed for 15 years had not been waiting. She had been preparing. And he was only now sitting alone in the silence of a house that no longer felt like his, beginning to understand what she had been preparing for. Richard Holt arrived at 8:47, 13 minutes early, which told Mark everything he needed to know about how seriously his lawyer was taking this. Richard was 61 years old, had handled some of the most complex financial litigation in Connecticut for 3 decades, and was not a man who rushed. When Richard Holt showed up early, it meant he was worried. He walked through the front door without knocking. Mark had left it unlocked, set his briefcase on the kitchen table, looked at the 3 documents spread across the marble counter, and did not say a single word for nearly 2 full minutes. He read. He turned pages. He went back and reread. Mark stood by the window with a cup of coffee he had made and not touched, watching his lawyer's face for information. Richard finally looked up. "How long," he said, "has Jessica been in the picture?" 2 years, Mark said. Richard nodded slowly, the way a doctor nods when a patient confirms what the scan already showed. "And you used company cards?" It was not a question. "Occasionally," Mark said. "How occasionally?" Mark looked at the window. "Enough that it shows up in the summary she prepared." Richard sat down in one of the kitchen chairs and folded his hands on the table. He had the expression of a man arranging difficult truths into a presentable order. "Mark, I need you to understand something before we go any further. Harwick Callaway does not take cases they cannot win. They are not in the business of pressure campaigns or long negotiations. When they file, it is because the client they represent has already won, and the legal process is simply the formality of collecting. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand that every case has leverage points," Mark said. "Not this one." Richard picked up the financial summary and held it for a moment. "This document alone, if it reflects accurate records, and I have no reason to believe it doesn't, this document alone represents potential criminal exposure, Mark. Not civil, criminal, wire fraud, embezzlement, depending on what else they have documented, possibly conspiracy." He set it back down. "Elena did not just file for divorce. She built a prosecution." The word landed in the kitchen like something physical. Mark set his coffee cup on the counter. "She's my wife, Richard, not a federal prosecutor." "She hired people who think like one," Richard said quietly. "The firm she's using has a former U.S. attorney on staff. I know him personally. He doesn't join cases for the courtroom drama. He joins cases because he sees a conviction." He paused. "When did you first notice the share acquisition, the holding companies?" "This morning," Mark said, "when Daniel called." Richard stared at him. "You had no idea?" "No." "For 8 years?" "No." Richard was quiet for a moment. "She is more organized than you gave her credit for." "Clearly," Mark said, and the word came out flatter than he intended, stripped of its usual confidence. Richard opened his briefcase and pulled out a yellow legal pad. "All right, here is what we are doing today. We are not going to the board meeting. I'm going to call Daniel's attorneys and request a postponement on the grounds that you need time to review the corporate structure claims. That buys us 48 hours minimum. Then I'm going to contact Harwick Callaway and open a dialogue about the divorce terms. We need to understand what Elena actually wants before we make any moves, because right now we are operating blind." "What she wants," Mark repeated. "Yes. She wants the company, Richard. She already has the company. She took majority control before the sun came up." "Then she wants something beyond the company," Richard said. "People who do this level of preparation always have a specific outcome in mind. She didn't spend years building this case just to take half your assets. She could have done that with any competent divorce attorney. She hired Harwick Callaway because she wants something total." He looked at Mark steadily. "And we need to find out what that is before she gets the opportunity to tell a courtroom instead of us." Mark's phone buzzed on the counter. He looked at the screen. A number he didn't recognize, a local area code, but not a contact he had saved. He answered. "Sterling." "Mr. Sterling." A woman's voice. Professional, precise, with the particular measured cadence of someone who had been trained to deliver information without reaction. My name is Caroline Reeves. I'm a senior associate at Harwick, Callaway & Associates. I'm calling on behalf of our client, Elena Sterling. Mark's eyes went to Richard. Richard immediately stood up and moved to his side, leaning close enough to hear. Ms. Reeves, Mark said evenly, my attorney is present. If you have communication for me, I'd suggest directing it through— Of course, she said smoothly. I'm happy to speak with Mr. Holt directly, but I wanted to extend a professional courtesy to you first. Mr. Sterling, given the timeline of events this morning. A brief pause. Our client has authorized us to inform you that effective 6 o'clock this morning, a temporary restraining order has been issued by the court, restricting the movement of funds from any jointly held account, any account with shared signatory access, and any account held under the Whitmore Architecture Group in which Mrs. Sterling holds an ownership interest. This order covers all domestic accounts. Mark said nothing. Additionally, Caroline Reeves continued, our client has requested that you be formally notified that the family residence at 14 Hargrove Lane, Greenwich, is listed as a marital asset subject to division. Our client is not requesting that you vacate at this time, but any material alteration to the property or removal of jointly owned assets will be considered a violation of the court order. Another pause. Do you have any questions, Mr. Sterling? Yes, Mark said, and his voice was very controlled now. Where is my wife? A brief silence on the line. Then, our client's location is her private business, Mr. Sterling. We will be in contact with Mr. Holt's office to schedule the initial disclosure conference. Have a good morning. The call ended. Mark lowered the phone. The kitchen felt smaller than it had 10 minutes ago. Richard was already writing on his legal pad. Temporary restraining order, he said almost to himself. They moved fast. She must have had the filing ready before she left the house. He looked up. Mark, I need to ask you something, and I need a completely honest answer. Is there anything in those financial records, anything at all, that connects to accounts outside of the United States? Mark was quiet for 3 seconds too long. Mark, there are some accounts, Mark said carefully, in the Caymans, structured legally, for tax purposes. Richard put his pen down. He picked it back up. He wrote something, crossed it out, and wrote it again. How much? Combined approximately $4 million. Richard did not visibly react, which was itself a reaction. He wrote the number down. Was Elena a signatory on any of those accounts? No. Does she know they exist? Mark hesitated. I don't know what she knows. That, Richard said, setting his pen down with a quiet click, is the most dangerous sentence you have said to me today. He closed his legal pad and looked at his client directly. Because if she knows about those accounts, and if Harwick Callaway has documentation of them, and if they have connected them to the financial irregularities in that summary, she left you, Mark, you understand that we are no longer talking about divorce law. We are talking about federal law. And at that point, I cannot be your only attorney in the room. The sentence sat between them. Then Mark's business phone rang. The number was the corporate main line of Whitmore Architecture Group, not Daniel's direct cell, but the main line. The company line. The line that connected to HR, to the board secretary, to the executive communication department. He answered it. A voice he recognized immediately. Sandra Cho, the board secretary, whose tone had always been carefully neutral in the way of someone who had witnessed too many executive disputes to take sides. Today her neutrality had a particular quality to it. Careful, formal, like she was reading from a prepared text. Mr. Sterling, I'm calling on behalf of the Whitmore Architecture Group Board of Directors. I have been asked to inform you that effective immediately, your executive access credentials to all company systems have been suspended, pending the outcome of today's board proceedings. Your corporate credit cards have been deactivated. Your parking access and building key card will be disabled at noon today. The board asks that you refrain from entering the Whitmore offices until the governance review is complete. A pause. I've been asked to express that this is a procedural measure and does not constitute termination of your employment contract at this time. At this time, Mark repeated. Yes, Mr. Sterling, at this time. Another pause. I'm sorry to make this call. I hope this is resolved quickly." She hung up. Mark stood absolutely still. Richard was watching him with the focused attention of a man monitoring someone for signs of shock. "My access has been suspended," Mark said. "I heard. She got to the board before Daniel even had time to call me." "Yes," Richard said. "She did." Mark put both hands flat on the marble counter and looked down at the surface for a moment. He breathed in through his nose, out through his mouth, the way he had trained himself to breathe in the middle of negotiations when the numbers were going the wrong direction, and he needed to stay in the room without showing panic. He straightened up. "I need to access the offshore accounts." Richard stood up immediately. "Mark, do not to move money, to understand what's there, to know what I'm working with. If you access those accounts today," Richard said, his voice dropping low and precise, "and Harwick Callaway has a monitor on your financial activity, which given what they have already demonstrated this morning, I would assume they do. Any access to those accounts today will appear on a record that a judge will see as an attempt to conceal or move assets after legal proceedings have been initiated. That is not a gray area. That is contempt, potentially fraud. Do not touch those accounts." Mark pulled his hand back from the counter. His personal phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. He opened it, a single line. "All 4 offshore account numbers have been submitted to the IRS whistleblower office. Documentation attached. E." He read it twice, 3 times. His brain processed the words but could not immediately build them into a meaning that made full sense because the meaning once assembled was so complete and so catastrophic that some protective function in his mind kept dismantling it before it could settle. He held the phone out to Richard without speaking. Richard read the text. His jaw moved slightly, the way a person's jaw moves when they are pressing back a reaction that they do not have time to have. He handed the phone back. "She reported it herself," he said. "Before you could. Before anyone could allege she was covering for you." He was quiet for a moment. "She just made herself a cooperating witness." "She reported her own accounts," Mark said. "They're your accounts," Richard said, "and she just handed them to the federal government with a bow on them and positioned herself as the person who came forward voluntarily." He picked up his briefcase, opened it, closed it again. "Mark, I have to be honest with you. In 30 years, I have not seen a civil matter convert to a potential federal investigation this quickly. What she has done this morning, the timing, the sequencing, the TRO, before you were even awake. The board notification, the IRS report, this was not spontaneous. This was scheduled. Every piece of it was scheduled to happen in a specific order this morning, so that by the time you opened that envelope, it was already done." Mark sat back down on the kitchen stool. "She knew I'd try to move the offshore money," he said almost quietly. "She knew I'd try to get ahead of it." "Yes," Richard said, "and she reported it first, so that any move I made after the fact would look like obstruction." "Yes. She thought about how I would respond," Mark said slowly, "and she prepared for that too." Richard did not answer, because there was nothing to add. For a moment, the kitchen was completely silent. The September light had shifted and was coming through the window at a different angle now, and the empty space where Elena's coffee mug had always sat seemed in that light almost aggressively empty. Mark's phone rang again. This time it was a number he recognized immediately and had never expected to see on his screen under circumstances like these. "David Marsh, senior partner at Connolly & Marsh, a firm that did not handle divorces, a firm that handled white-collar criminal defense." He picked up. "David?" "Mark." David Marsh's voice was the voice of a man who had spent 30 years in federal courtrooms. It had a particular gravity to it, a weight. "I've been contacted by a colleague at Harwick Callaway. As a professional courtesy, I'm calling to let you know that the documentation they have assembled is being reviewed by someone I respect in the U.S. Attorney's Office. This has moved beyond family court." "I know," Mark said. "You need representation beyond Richard's scope," David said. "I'm not in the habit of ambulance chasing, which is why I'm making this call directly, rather than waiting for you to find me through a referral. Do you want to meet today?" Mark looked at Richard. Richard was already nodding. "Yes," Mark said. "I want to meet today." "My office at 2, David said. "And Mark, don't use your corporate card to pay for parking. Use cash." He hung up. Mark set the phone down on the counter. 2 lawyers, 2 different categories of law. That was where his morning had arrived. He had left Jessica's apartment at 5:47 with a smile on his face and a text on his phone that said she suspects nothing, and by 9:15 he was sitting in his own kitchen arranging criminal defense counsel while a TRO locked his finances, and his wife watched from wherever she had gone with the calm patience of a woman who had already finished winning. He thought about calling Jessica again. He didn't. He already knew what that call would sound like. Instead, he sat with Richard for the next hour and a half, and they went through every document Elena had left line by line, the way you go through wreckage after a collapse, not to fix it, but to understand the full dimensions of what was gone. The private investigator she had hired was thorough in a way that made Mark's chest tighten with something that was almost involuntary respect. Every occasion with Jessica was documented, every hotel, every restaurant, every car ride visible from a public street. The photographs were not just evidence of the affair, they were a timeline. A complete, unbroken timeline of 2 years of deception, laid out with the clarity of a forensic audit. And then there was the financial summary. Richard had worked in financial law long enough to read between the annotations, and what he read, there was not the work of a paralegal who had spent a few weeks pulling bank records. The level of detail, the cross-referencing between company expense codes and personal account deposits, the identification of the exact transfer mechanisms Mark had used, the flagging of specific dates that corresponded to project billings that had been inflated, all of it pointed to someone who had been building this document for a very long time. "She must have had access to records you didn't know she had," Richard said, turning a page. "She had access to everything in the house," Mark said. "Home office, filing cabinets. I never locked anything from her. Why would I? She never seemed interested in the business side." "She wasn't interested," Richard said. "She was careful." He set the page down. "There is a difference." At 11:53, Mark's car, his personal vehicle, the $60,000 one he had driven home from Jessica's apartment that morning, did not start. He tried the key fob from the kitchen where he could see it parked in the drive. Nothing. He tried again. Nothing. He walked outside and tried the physical key. The dashboard lights came on for exactly 2 seconds, then went dark. He called the dealership. They pulled up his account, and a customer service representative named Tyler informed him with genuine apologetic energy that the vehicle had been remotely disabled that morning through the manufacturer's tracking and security system, triggered by a legal hold associated with a financial dispute. Tyler was very sorry. There was nothing he could do until the legal hold was lifted. Tyler hoped Mark had a nice day. Mark walked back inside. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, then began to laugh. Not the arrogant laugh from the car that morning, a different kind. The hollow, disbelieving laugh of a man stacking up losses and finding the total genuinely unbelievable. His wife was gone. His accounts were frozen. His company access was suspended. His car was disabled in his own driveway. His mistress had disappeared the moment his credit card stopped working. His divorce attorney was worried. His criminal defense attorney wanted to meet at 2. All of this before noon. All of it set in motion before he had walked through the front door. Richard looked up from the documents. "Are you all right?" "No," Mark said with an honesty that surprised both of them. "I'm not." He pulled out his phone one final time and opened his text thread with Elena. It went back years, grocery lists, schedule confirmations, the occasional forwarded reservation confirmation. The ordinary quiet text thread of a marriage that had stopped being a marriage so gradually that he had never noticed the exact moment it ended. He typed, "We need to talk, please." He watched the screen, the message delivered, 1 gray check mark, then 2. She had read it. No response came. He waited 4 minutes. Nothing. Then the read receipt disappeared. She had turned them off while he was watching. Even that small act of erasure was deliberate. Even that was prepared for. He set the phone face down on the counter. Richard closed his legal pad, gathered the documents carefully, and put them in his briefcase. "I'll make the calls," he said. "Postponement request to the board opening dialogue with Harwick Calloway. I'll drive you to David's office at 1:30. He paused at the kitchen doorway and looked back at his client. "Mark, I need you to do something between now and then. I need you to sit down somewhere quiet and think about everything you know, everything about what she might have. Not what you think she knows, what she actually has. Because when we walk into David Marsh's office, we need to walk in with the truth, and right now the truth is the only currency you have left. Richard left. The front door closed. The house returned to its silence. Mark sat at the kitchen table alone in a house full of expensive things with frozen accounts and a disabled car, and no one left to call, and he thought about Elena. Not the Elena he had dismissed and ignored and taken for granted for 15 years. The other one. The one who had been sitting across from him at the same kitchen table, quietly reading, quietly listening, quietly remembering, while he talked about his deals and his plans and his ambitions and never once thought to wonder what she was thinking. The one who had apparently been thinking about all of this for a very long time. Richard drove. Mark sat in the passenger seat with his hands in his lap and watched Greenwich pass by outside the window, the clean sidewalks, the old money architecture, the kind of neighborhood that projected permanence and stability, the kind of neighborhood that said nothing here falls apart. He had lived in this town for 18 years. He knew the names on the mailboxes, the firms behind the facades, the handshakes that held everything together. He had always felt driving these streets that he was one of the people this town was built for. He did not feel that now. Richard had made his calls from the kitchen before they left. The board postponement request had been submitted. Harwick Calloway had acknowledged receipt and responded that they would allow 48 hours as a professional courtesy, which Richard said in a tone that communicated clearly that was not generosity. That was confidence. You only grant extensions when you know the extra time changes nothing. They arrived at David Marsh's office at 1:58. David was already in the conference room with a second attorney. Mark didn't recognize a younger woman introduced as Priya Venkat, who handled federal compliance. She shook Mark's hand with the brisk efficiency of someone who had read every document about him before he walked through the door. She probably had. David wasted no time. He sat down, opened a folder, and looked at Mark directly. I'm going to tell you what I know, and then you're going to tell me what I don't. Is that acceptable? Yes, Mark said. Harwick Calloway filed the divorce petition 6 days ago. The TRO was granted this morning before 7. The IRS whistleblower submission was filed simultaneously, meaning Elena's team coordinated the civil and the federal filing on the same morning, probably within the same hour. David tapped the folder. That level of coordination requires months of preparation and a specific legal strategy that I recognize. The former U.S. attorney on staff at Harwick Calloway, his name is Gerald Foss. He used to run the Financial Crimes Division in Connecticut. He is not there for the divorce. He is there for the criminal exposure. Elena didn't just hire divorce lawyers. She hired a prosecution team and put a family law wrapper around it. Priya spoke without looking up from her own notes. The offshore accounts are the centerpiece. 4 accounts combined approximately $4 million routed through 2 Cayman entities. The IRS submission will trigger an automatic referral to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. That process typically takes between 3 and 6 weeks before formal contact is made. We have that window to get ahead of it, but only if we move immediately. Get ahead of it how? Mark said. Voluntary disclosure, Priya said. You approach the IRS before they approach you. Full cooperation. Complete financial transparency. It reduces exposure significantly and removes the obstruction element entirely. She looked up. But it requires you to disclose everything. Not the $4 million. Everything. Every account, every transfer, every structure, everything. Mark was quiet. David leaned forward. Mark, I have defended people in federal financial cases for 30 years. The ones who survive not just legally, but as people with any life remaining on the other side. They are always the ones who decided early that the truth was their only remaining asset. The ones who didn't survive are the ones who spent the first 2 weeks believing they could still engineer their way out. He paused. You are an engineer by instinct. I understand that. But this is not a deal you can structure. This is a moment where you decide which version of your future you are willing to accept. Mark looked at the table. Then he looked at Richard, who gave him a single slow nod. All right, Mark said. Everything. And for the next 2 hours, Mark Sterling told the truth for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember. It came out in pieces awkwardly at first, with the halting quality of a man who had spent so many years managing information that pure disclosure felt structurally wrong. But Priya asked precise questions, and David listened without reacting, and slowly the full picture assembled itself across the conference table. The transfers had started 7 years ago. Small at first, redirected project overruns, inflated vendor invoices, the kind of financial maneuvering that lived in the gray zone between aggressive accounting and fraud. Then they had grown. The offshore structures had been set up 5 years ago with the help of an accountant who was no longer in the country. The total exposure when everything was laid out was closer to 11 million across all vehicles, not 4. Mark had been compartmentalizing even inside his own memory. When he finished, the conference room was very quiet. David closed his folder. 11 million, he said. Approximately, Mark said. And Elena's team has documentation of how much of this, I don't know, based on the financial summary she left you this morning. Priya said, they have clean documentation of at least 6.3 million. The remainder may or may not be in what they submitted to the IRS. We won't know until the referral is processed. She made a note. The voluntary disclosure filing needs to happen within the next 72 hours to have maximum impact. We'll begin drafting tonight. Mark nodded. His phone buzzed. He looked at it reflexively, the way people look at phones when they are overwhelmed, and any distraction feels preferable to stillness. It was a news alert, a local Greenwich business publication, a digital outlet that covered the finance and architecture sectors. The headline read, Whitmore Architecture Group CFO Mark Sterling steps down amid corporate governance review. He had not stepped down. He had been suspended. But the story was already written, already published, already indexed. He showed it to David without a word. David looked at it, showed it to Priya, and said, Don't respond, don't comment, don't call the publication. Any statement you make right now becomes a public record that can be used. He looked at Mark steadily. Who would have given them this story this quickly? Mark thought about it. The board secretary called me at 9. If the story ran before 2, he stopped. Someone on the board made that call, or someone connected to Harwick Callaway. Information management, Priya said almost admiringly. They are controlling the narrative while you are still in the building figuring out what happened. She closed her notepad. Mark, do you have any personal assets? Cash physical assets? Anything that are not connected to a frozen account or a jointly held vehicle, he thought. About $3,000 in a personal checking account, a watch, a set of cufflinks. The room was quiet for a moment in the particular way rooms go quiet when a number is much smaller than expected. Okay, David said, with the measured professionalism of a man recalibrating. That's what we're working with for now. He stood signaling the meeting was moving to its next phase. Richard will take you home. We begin the voluntary disclosure process tonight. You do not speak to the media, to anyone at Whitmore, to Jessica, or to Elena's attorneys without one of us present. And Mark. He looked at him one final time across the conference table. I want you to go home tonight and sleep, if you can, because tomorrow is going to be harder than today. It did not seem possible that anything could be harder than today. Mark almost said so. He didn't. Richard drove him back to the estate. It was 4:17 in the afternoon. The day had eaten itself whole. Mark got out of the car, thanked Richard with a handshake that communicated something beyond gratitude, something closer to the desperate grip of a man holding onto the last solid thing in a shifting room, and walked back into the house alone. He made himself a drink. He sat in the living room in a chair he almost never sat in because it was Elena's chair, the one she used when she read in the evenings, positioned near the window for the light. He had never understood why she preferred this chair over the larger, more expensive one across the room. Sitting in it now, he noticed the angle of the window gave a clear view of the driveway, the gate, the long, oak-lined approach to the house. From this chair, you could see everything that arrived and everything that left. He had never thought to wonder how many evenings she had watched him leave from this chair. His phone rang, a number he did not know. Against every instruction David Marsh had given him 45 minutes ago, he answered it because the day had reduced him to a state where not knowing felt worse than any possible bad news. Mr. Sterling, a man's voice, neutral official with a quality that immediately registered as federal. not threatening. Simply factual, the way certain voices are when the person speaking them has the authority to be relaxed. My name is Special Agent Thomas Riley with the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. I wonder if you have a few minutes. Mark's hand tightened on the phone so hard his knuckles went pale. My attorneys have advised me not to speak without representation present, Mark said. The words came out steadier than he expected. Of course, Agent Riley said without any change in tone. That's entirely appropriate. I'm not calling to interview you, Mr. Sterling. I'm calling as a professional courtesy, the same one that was extended to us this morning by a cooperating party, to let you know that we have opened a preliminary inquiry into the financial matters referenced in the IRS submission filed earlier today. We'll be in contact with your attorneys through proper channels. I simply wanted you to be aware that the timeline has moved faster than the standard referral process. A brief pause. We appreciate your attention to this matter. He hung up. Mark sat in Elena's chair and did not move for a full 3 minutes. The FBI, not in 3 to 6 weeks as Priya had projected. Today, the same day. They had moved the same day, which meant the IRS submission had not been a cold filing. It had been a warm handoff. Someone at Harwick Callaway, or connected to them, had made a phone call alongside the filing. Gerald Foss, the former U.S. attorney, had called someone he knew. And that someone had moved the process from a standard referral timeline to same-day contact. Mark called David Marsh. David answered on the first ring, which told Mark that David had been expecting this call. An Agent Riley just called me, Mark said. I know, David said. He called my office 12 minutes ago as well. They opened a preliminary inquiry. Priya is already revising the voluntary disclosure timeline. We need to file by tomorrow morning, not 72 hours. Can you be in my office at 7 a.m.? Yes, Mark said. Don't answer any more calls from numbers you don't recognize. I know. I answered this one. I'm sorry. Did you say anything beyond invoking your right to counsel? No. Good. 7 a.m. Try to sleep. David ended the call. Mark set the phone on the arm of the chair. Outside, through Elena's window, the autumn light was going gold and flat across the driveway. The oak trees were doing what oak trees do in September, beginning to let go of things quietly one at a time, with no drama, simply releasing what they no longer needed. He thought about calling his mother. She was 74, lived in upstate New York, and he called her every other Sunday with the dutiful regularity of a son who had stopped being emotionally present years before the call stopped being enough. He did not call her. He did not know what he would say. He did not know how to explain today to anyone who had not been inside it. He thought about Jessica, not with longing. That particular feeling had been thoroughly extinguished somewhere around 9 that morning when she had asked if his credit card was working. He thought about her with the cold clarity of retrospect. 2 years. He had told himself it was passion connection, the feeling of being truly seen by someone, sitting in his wife's chair in the fading afternoon light of a day that had dismantled him completely. He understood it for what it had actually been. It had been the most expensive distraction of his life. It had cost him $11 million, his company, his reputation, his freedom, and the woman who had sat in this chair for 15 years, watching him leave and saying nothing. The woman who had, in saying nothing, been building everything she needed. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he recognized this time, Daniel Whitmore. Not the formal Daniel of the morning's phone call, but a shorter, more human message that arrived with the slightly stunned quality of something written by a man who had spent a day processing a shock. The board voted this afternoon, Mark. I'm sorry, it was unanimous. They had no choice. The governance exposure alone, I want you to know, I argued for due process. But with the federal inquiry and Harwick Callaway's documentation and Elena's shareholder position, there was no room. Effective today, your employment contract has been terminated for cause. I am genuinely sorry. I hope you find your way through this. Mark read it twice. Then he set the phone face down on the arm of the chair. Terminated for cause. Those 3 words in the language of executive employment contracts had specific and devastating meaning. They did not just end his position, they voided his severance. They triggered the clawback provisions on his last 3 years of bonuses. They exposed him to personal liability for any financial irregularities discovered during his tenure. Terminated for cause was not the end of a job. It was the beginning of the next phase of collapse. He sat with that for a while. At 6:41, he heard a sound he had not expected the gate intercom, a car at the front gate. He went to the intercom panel in the front hallway and pressed the visual feed button. 2 vehicles at the gate, a dark sedan and an SUV, men in jackets. He could see the word on the jackets from the camera feed. FBI. Not tomorrow, not through channels, not with attorneys present, tonight. His hands moved before his brain fully processed. He called David Marsh. David answered in 2 rings. "Are you home?" David said, which told Mark that David already knew. "They're at my gate," Mark said. "Do not open the gate. Do not go outside. I'm calling Riley directly. Do not speak to them until I call you back. Do you have the gate remote in your hand?" "Yes." "Do not press it." David's voice was controlled and absolute. "I'll call you back in 5 minutes." Mark stood at the intercom panel and watched the 2 vehicles on the small screen. The agents were not rushing. They were not dramatic. They were simply there in the way that institutional authority is simply there, patient, certain, unhurried by the discomfort of the person on the other side. David called back in 4 minutes. "They have a warrant, Mark. It's a search warrant for financial records and digital devices. You have to let them in. I'm 40 minutes away. You open the gate. You stay in the living room. You do not answer questions. You do not show them anything they don't specifically request. You say 4 words to every question they ask. 'My attorney is coming.' Can you do that?" "Yes," Mark said. "Open the gate." Mark pressed the button. The gate swung open. He watched on the screen as the 2 vehicles pulled up the long drive. He walked to the front door and opened it before they knocked, which was the only remaining form of control he had. Special Agent Riley was younger than his voice had suggested, early 40s, with the compact efficiency of someone who spent his days doing this and felt no particular excitement about it. He showed Mark the warrant with the practiced motion of someone who had shown warrants 1,000 times. Mark looked at it. His name, his address, a list of specific items, hard drives, external storage, physical financial documents, communication devices. "Mr. Sterling," Riley said, "thank you for your cooperation. We'll try to be thorough and quick." "My attorney is coming," Mark said. Riley nodded. "Of course." They came inside. 6 of them, 2 agents, 4 support personnel with equipment cases. They moved through the house with the organized quiet of professionals, and Mark stood in the living room in Elena's chair and watched them. They went to his home office first. He heard drawers opening, the sound of equipment being handled, the occasional exchange of quiet professional words between agents. They were in the office for 20 minutes before one of the support personnel came into the living room carrying Mark's home desktop hard drive in an evidence bag. He showed it to Mark with the professional courtesy of documentation. Mark said nothing. The agent nodded and continued. They found the external drives in the office closet. They found the physical folders, years of personal financial records that Mark had kept in a fireproof box, believing himself organized and prudent. They found the notebook he kept in his desk drawer, the one with handwritten account numbers and access codes that he had never transferred to digital because he had always believed physical was safer. When they found the notebook, Riley came to the living room doorway and held it up. "Mr. Sterling, I need to confirm this document was located in your home office desk drawer for the purposes of the warrant inventory." "My attorney is coming," Mark said. Riley made a note. He returned to the office. David arrived at 7:22. He came through the front door, went straight to Riley, exchanged credentials, and reviewed the warrant in the hallway in the clipped professional shorthand of 2 people who had been in this exact situation before. He came to the living room and sat across from Mark. "They have the notebook," Mark said quietly. David's expression did not change. "I know. I saw it in the inventory list." He kept his voice low. "Mark, the notebook changes the timeline. The account numbers in that book, if they cross-reference to accounts not previously disclosed in the IRS filing, we have an expanded exposure problem." He paused. "How many accounts are in the notebook?" Mark looked at the floor. 14. David was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than any of the other quiet moments in a day full of them. "How much combined?" Mark did not answer immediately. He pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead. He thought about the morning, the drive home from Jessica's, the laugh in the car, the tie in the mirror. The man who had pulled up to these gates 9 hours ago, believing himself untouchable. Combined, he said slowly, closer to 23 million. David Marsh sat back in his chair. He did not speak for a full 10 seconds. Outside, the agents continued their quiet, thorough work. Somewhere in the house, a drawer closed. 23 million, David said. Yes. David leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at his client with the steady, unsentimental gaze of a man recalibrating everything he had believed about the next 6 months. Mark, I need you to understand something. When we walk into the U.S. Attorney's office tomorrow, and we will be walking in tomorrow, not filing paperwork physically, walking in the number that matters more than any other number, is not the money. It is the cooperating witness on the other side of this case. He paused. Elena did not just report this. Elena documented it, organized it, sequenced the disclosure to maximize federal impact, and positioned herself as the most credible cooperating witness in the room before you were even awake this morning. She is not an angry wife, Mark. She is the government's primary source. And whatever deal we can build for you depends entirely on what she has already given them. Mark stared at the far wall. She knew about all of it, he said, not a question. Based on what we're seeing today, David said, I believe she has known for a very long time. The agents finished their sweep at 8:51. They cataloged everything they took with professional precision, gave Mark a copy of the inventory, thanked him for his cooperation, and left. The gate closed behind their vehicles. The house went quiet again. Mark sat alone for the 3rd time that day in a house that no longer felt like it belonged to him, surrounded by the expensive evidence of a life that was being systematically dismantled, not by an enemy, not by a rival, not by bad luck or market forces or any of the adversaries he had spent his career preparing to face, by his wife, by the woman in the quiet chair by the window, by the woman he had kissed on the forehead on his way out the door to Jessica's apartment, believing she was asleep, not knowing she had already been awake for an hour, already knowing everything already finished. He picked up his phone. He opened the text thread with Elena one final time. He typed nothing. He simply looked at her name at the top of the screen for a long moment, then set the phone back down. There was nothing left to say that she had not already answered. David Marsh's office at 7 in the morning had a different quality than it had the afternoon before. The afternoon meeting had been crisis management, fast reactive to attorneys, absorbing new information and making rapid decisions. This morning felt different, slower, more deliberate. The way things feel when the emergency phase is over and what remains is simply the long, unglamorous work of consequence. Mark had not slept. He had sat in Elena's chair until almost 2 in the morning, not thinking clearly, not planning, just existing inside the wreckage of the day with the particular exhaustion of a man whose mind will not stop running, even when it has nowhere useful to go. At 2, he had moved to the bedroom, laid on top of the covers in his clothes, and stared at the ceiling until the room began to lighten at 5:30. Then he had showered, dressed, and called a car service because his own vehicle was still disabled in the driveway. The car service had charged him $62, which he had paid from the $3,000 remaining in his personal checking account, and the smallness of that transaction, $62, counted carefully from the last accessible money he had had, produced a feeling he could not name. Priya Venkat was already at the conference table when he arrived, her laptop open, 2 coffee cups positioned precisely a printed draft of the voluntary disclosure filing beside her right hand. She looked like someone who had worked through the night, which she probably had. We expanded the disclosure based on the notebook account numbers, she said without preamble while Mark was still removing his coat. The filing now covers $23.4 million across 16 accounts and 3 offshore vehicles. The narrative section frames your cooperation as proactive and complete. She slid the draft across the table. Read it carefully. Every word in this document becomes your official position. If anything in here is inaccurate or incomplete, we need to know now because there is no version of this that gets better by adding to it later. Mark sat down and read it, all 12 pages. He read slowly, the way he had learned to read the documents Elena had left him, not skimming for highlights, but absorbing every line for what it actually said. When he finished, he set it on the table. "It's accurate," he said. "Complete?" Priya asked. He thought for 2 seconds. In the old life, the life of 48 hours ago, 2 seconds of hesitation before answering a direct question was a negotiating technique. Now it was just a man making sure he was telling the truth. "Complete," he said. David arrived at 7:20, shook Mark's hand with the grip of a man who had decided to be steady so his client didn't have to be reviewed the final draft for 11 minutes, made 2 small changes in the narrative section, and looked up. "We file at 9. Then we call Agent Riley and inform him the voluntary disclosure has been submitted. Then we request a meeting with the U.S. Attorney's Office for later this week." He set down his pen. "Mark, I want to prepare you for something. When we go into that meeting with the U.S. Attorney, the first question they will ask before anything about the money, before anything about the corporate structure, is what you can offer them. Cooperation has a currency in federal cases. Information about other parties, other transactions, other individuals involved in the financial structures, the accountant who set up the offshore vehicles, anyone who had knowledge of and participated in the transfers." He looked at Mark steadily. "I need you to think about who else is in this picture." Mark thought about a man named Victor Salles, the accountant who had structured the Cayman entities, who had been living in Portugal for the past 2 years, who had called Mark exactly once since leaving the country, a brief call that Mark had ended quickly because he had understood instinctively that association with Victor at that point was a liability. He had not thought about Victor in months. Victor had not thought about Mark apparently either. "There's an accountant," Mark said. "Victor Salles. He built the offshore structures. He's in Portugal." Priya was already typing. "Full name, last known address, any contact information." Mark gave her everything he had. It felt like a different kind of betrayal than the ones he had been committing for years. Not the self-serving kind, but the desperate kind, the kind that arrives when a man has run out of alternatives, and the only remaining currency he has is other people's exposure. He did not feel good about it. He also did not stop. The voluntary disclosure was filed at 9:04. Priya sent the confirmation to both David and Mark simultaneously. 1 email, 2 recipients, a PDF attachment that represented the most complete honest accounting Mark Sterling had produced in over a decade. He looked at the confirmation number on his phone and felt nothing particular, not relief, not regret. Just the flat recognition that a thing had been done. David called Agent Riley at 9:15. Mark sat across from him and listened to one side of a conversation that was professional, brief, and stripped of any comfort. Yes, the disclosure had been filed. Yes, full cooperation was being offered. Yes, a meeting with the U.S. Attorney's Office was being formally requested. Riley apparently said something that made David's expression shift almost imperceptibly towards something tighter. David said, "I understand. We'll be available." He ended the call. "What did he say?" Mark asked. David set the phone on the table. "The warrant executed last night covered more than the financial records. They recovered emails from your home desktop, correspondence between you and Victor Salles from 4 years ago." He paused. "Apparently the emails are fairly specific about the intent behind the offshore structures." Mark closed his eyes. He had written those emails at his desk at home late at night, believing with the confident carelessness of a man who had never been caught that digital communications were manageable. He had been wrong about that, the way he had been wrong about most things, which was completely and without awareness. "How specific?" Mark said. "Riley used the word instructive," David said, which is prosecutor language for, "This is exactly what we needed." The silence that followed had a particular weight to it, not the shocked silence of earlier moments in the past 2 days, but the quieter, heavier silence of a man arriving at the moment where the last possible avenue of uncertainty closes. The emails were instructive. Victor Salles was in Portugal. The voluntary disclosure had been filed this morning with $23 million accounted for. Elena was a cooperating witness with years of documented evidence. The FBI had the notebook with 16 account numbers. The company had terminated him for cause. Mark opened his eyes. "What does a plea deal look like?" he said, "realistically." David leaned back. Wire fraud embezzlement conspiracy to commit financial crimes. Given the voluntary disclosure, the cooperation on sales, and the absence of violence or victims beyond the corporate structure, realistically, with full cooperation, the U.S. attorney might come down to a single consolidated charge. Sentencing on that charge with cooperation credit could range from 18 months to 4 years, depending on the judge and the completeness of your assistance. He paused. Without cooperation, without the voluntary disclosure, without anything we've built in the last 18 hours, you would be looking at 12 to 18 years on multiple counts. 4 years. Mark let that number settle into him the way large numbers settle slowly, requiring time to become real. 4 years of his life in a federal facility as the former CFO of a company that had already moved on without him. 4 years beginning from a point at which he had nothing left to protect. And the only thing standing between 4 years and 18 was how completely he was willing to give them, Victor Salles and anyone else in the picture, and every honest answer to every question they asked. Start the cooperation process, Mark said. The days that followed arrived and passed with the grinding bureaucratic pace of federal legal proceedings, a rhythm completely unlike the fast-moving devastation of that first day, but in its own way, just as relentless. There were meetings in federal offices with people who were professionally courteous and utterly unmoved by Mark's former status. There were document reviews and depositions and long hours in conference rooms going through financial records line by line. Victor Salles was located and detained in Portugal within 8 days, which Priya mentioned in passing during a status call with the precise neutral tone of someone noting a completed task. The divorce proceedings moved on a parallel track with the same patient, methodical efficiency that had characterized everything Elena's attorneys did. Mark's access to marital assets remained frozen. The estate at Hargrove Lane was formally listed as a disputed marital property. Richard Holt continued to communicate with Harwick Callaway through the formal channels of legal correspondence, but the negotiations had a quality that was less like negotiation and more like inventory, a careful accounting of what remained and who it would go to. Mark was staying in a hotel by the 3rd week. The estate felt too large and too empty, and too much like a museum of a life he no longer occupied. And the hotel, a modest business-class property near David's office that cost $112 a night, charged to a single personal credit card that had not yet been touched by the legal proceedings because it had never been connected to any joint account, felt more honest, more proportionate, less like standing in the ruins of something pretending it was still standing. He called his mother on a Tuesday evening in the 3rd week. He had been dreading the call with the specific dread of someone who knows that explaining the truth will require them to hear it, reflected back through someone else's pain. His mother, Eleanor, answered on the 2nd ring with the warmth of a woman who had been waiting, not because she knew, but because she always answered that way with warmth, because that was who she was. "Mark," she said, "I've been trying to reach you." "I know, Mom. I'm sorry, there are some things happening." "I saw the news," she said quietly. He had not known the news had reached upstate New York. He supposed he should have. The Greenwich business publication story had been picked up by 2 regional outlets and a financial trade site. CFO of major architecture firm steps down amid federal inquiry had enough of the ingredients for circulation money, infidelity, fraud, a powerful man in a rapid fall. "The story doesn't have everything right," he said reflexively. "Mark." Her voice was gentle but firm, the same voice she had used when he was 11, and she knew he was lying about something. "Tell me what actually happened." And he told her. Not the managed version, not the strategic framing he had rehearsed with attorneys, the actual version, the affair, the money, the years of it. Elena's methodical preparation, the FBI, the plea deal in progress, all of it in a hotel room with $112 a night of remaining dignity, sitting on the edge of the bed in his socks, talking to his 74-year-old mother because there was no one else left who would listen without billing him. His mother was quiet for a long moment when he finished. "Did you love her?" she finally asked. "Elena." He was not prepared for that question. He sat with it. "I thought I did," he said, "in the beginning. And then I stopped paying attention," he said, "and I told myself that was the same as things being fine." His mother made a sound, not a judgment, not a condemnation, just the small sound a person makes when they hear something painful and recognize it. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. "I'm going to take the plea deal," he said. "And then I'm going to—" "I don't know yet, Mom. I honestly don't know." "That's the most honest thing you've said in a long time," she told him, not unkindly, just with the precision of a woman who had known her son for 53 years and could tell the difference. The plea deal was formalized 6 weeks after the arrest. Mark Sterling pleaded guilty to one consolidated count of wire fraud with an agreed statement of facts that covered the full scope of the financial misconduct. The cooperation credit for the Sal's information, Victor Sal's had been extradited and was now providing information of his own. In the way of cooperative witnesses who understand the math, reduced the sentencing recommendation to 2 years and 4 months in a federal correctional facility, followed by 3 years of supervised release and full financial restitution. The sentencing hearing was brief and procedurally clean. Mark stood before the judge in a suit he had worn to a dozen business victories, and the judge, a woman in her early 60s, with the measured, unhurried delivery of someone who had presided over many such moments and found none of them exceptional. Read through the agreed statement of facts, confirmed Mark's understanding of the plea, and imposed the sentence. 2 years and 4 months. Federal Correctional Institution, Danbury, Connecticut. Reporting date in 30 days. Mark said, "Yes, Your Honor," to every question directed at him. He thanked the judge. David shook his hand outside the courtroom. Richard Holt, who had driven down for the hearing, shook his hand as well and said, "You handled it well," which was the highest available compliment in the language of men who negotiate difficult outcomes for a living. Mark nodded. He was not sure he had handled anything. He had simply been present for what happened to him. He used the 30 days before reporting to settle what could be settled. The divorce finalized with a speed that reflected Elena's legal preparation. There was very little left to dispute. The estate went to Elena as the majority marital asset, which her attorneys had framed cleanly, given Mark's pending incarceration and loss of income. The remaining personal accounts depleted by legal fees were divided according to the court's calculation. Mark received a settlement amount that, by any objective measure, was appropriate given the circumstances, meaning it was a fraction of what the marriage had been worth at its height, and every penny of it was legitimate and documented, because Elena's attorneys had made sure of that. He signed the divorce papers in Richard Holt's office on a gray October afternoon, sitting at the same conference table where he had first reviewed Elena's original filing 7 weeks earlier. The papers were thick. All of Elena's filings were thick, thorough, and immaculate, and he signed each page where the tabs indicated, without reading every line, because he had already read everything once, and there was no version of reading it again that produced a different outcome. When he finished, Richard gathered the pages and said, "That's everything." Mark nodded. He sat for a moment after Richard left the room to make copies alone at the conference table and tried to identify what he was feeling. Not grief exactly, not relief, something closer to the feeling of finishing a very long, very difficult thing and finding that the other side of it is simply more life, quieter and smaller than the life before. He thought about Elena. He had not spoken to her directly since the morning she left, since before the morning she left, technically since she had been gone by the time he walked through the door. He had received one piece of communication from her that was not filtered through attorneys. A single email sent 6 weeks into the legal proceedings, 3 sentences long. "Mark, I hope the legal process resolves in a way that allows you to rebuild. I am not your enemy. I simply could not continue to be someone you didn't see." No signature. Just Elena. He had read it several times. He had not responded partly because David had advised against any direct communication, and partly because there was nothing to say that was adequate to those 3 sentences. She had summarized 15 years of marriage with more precision and more generosity than he deserved, and she had done it in 3 sentences, and any response he could construct felt inadequate. The night before he reported to Danbury, he stayed in the hotel one final time. He packed one bag. The facility had specific guidelines about what inmates could bring, and the list was brief and practical, in a way that reduced everything to its essentials. He sat on the hotel bed and looked at the bag and thought about everything that had not fit. The suits, the watches, the cufflinks, the car still in the driveway of the estate, still disabled, probably towed by now. The office at Whitmore, where someone else was already sitting, already managing the Hargrove account, already performing the role he had occupied for 2 decades. His phone a simple model, because the FBI had kept his old one as evidence, and he had replaced it with the cheapest available option, had almost no contacts left in it. His mother, David Marsh, Richard Holt, a cousin in Michigan he had not spoken to in 4 years. The car service he used now that his own vehicle was gone. He called his mother. She answered on the second ring, same as always. "I'm reporting tomorrow," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you ready?" "I don't think ready is the right word," he said. "No," she agreed. "Probably not." She was quiet for a moment. "Mark, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think before you answer. Not the lawyer answer, the real one." "Okay," he said. "Do you understand what you did? Not legally, actually." He thought about it. He thought about the laugh in the car. He thought about the text to Jessica, "She suspects nothing. She never will." He thought about Elena in her chair by the window watching him leave, not saying a word. Watching him leave over and over for 15 years, while she prepared for the day. She would not watch him leave anymore, because she would already be gone. "Yes," he said, "I think I'm starting to." "That's enough for tonight," his mother said gently. "Get some sleep. I'll call you every week." He said goodnight. He lay on the hotel bed in the dark. Outside, the ordinary sounds of a city evening continued without any acknowledgement of what was happening in this particular room. Cars passing, voices, the distant sound of a restaurant closing for the night. The world moving forward with the complete indifference of a world that does not reorganize itself around individual consequences. He thought about the morning this had all begun. 5:47, the gate opening automatically, the drive confident and unhurried of a man returning to the life he believed was permanently his. The front door, the silence, the envelope on the marble counter with his name written in Elena's deliberate, patient handwriting. He had opened that envelope believing it was the beginning of a problem he would solve. He understood now that it was not the beginning of anything. It was the end of something that had been ending for a very long time. And Elena had simply chosen the moment to make visible what had already been true. He closed his eyes. Sleep, when it finally came, was dreamless and complete. The deep, exhausted sleep of a man who has stopped running and simply fallen down and found that the ground at least is solid. The next morning, a Tuesday in November, Mark Sterling picked up his single bag, checked out of the hotel, and rode a car service to the Federal Correctional Institution at Danbury. The driver made small talk for the first 10 minutes, then sensing the passenger's silence, let the rest of the drive pass without conversation. The facility appeared through the windshield with the flat institutional reality of a place that does not try to be anything other than what it is. Mark got out of the car. He stood for a moment with his bag in his hand. The driver pulled away. A correctional officer at the intake entrance looked up at him with the neutral professional attention of someone who had processed hundreds of arrivals and found them all approximately equivalent. "Name," the officer said. "Sterling," Mark said. "Mark Sterling." The officer found his name on the intake sheet, made a check beside it, and handed him a form. "Fill this out completely. Leave your personal items in the intake basket. You'll be assigned a number and a housing unit." He looked back at his desk. "Welcome to Danbury." Mark Sterling, who had once signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, who had driven a $60,000 car, who had laughed at his own reflection in a rear-view mirror on a September morning, believing himself untouchable, took the form, picked up the provided pen, and began to fill it out. Inmate number 4, 9201, Housing Unit C. Library assignment 3 days a week. The man who had once controlled everything now had a number, a unit, and a schedule that someone else had made for him. And somewhere outside those walls in the world that had already moved on, Elena Sterling was doing exactly what she had always done, quietly, methodically, and completely on her own terms. The library at FCY Danbury smelled like paper and institutional cleaning fluid and the particular stillness of a place where time moves differently than it does outside. Mark had been assigned there on his 3rd day, and by the end of the first week, he had understood that the assignment was either a coincidence or a quiet joke the universe was telling at his expense. A man who had once managed billion-dollar portfolios now managed a cart of returned books, wheeling it between metal shelving units and replacing each volume in its designated slot with the kind of careful attention to order that in his previous life he had applied to financial structures worth 100 times the GDP of small countries. He did not complain about it. That surprised him, actually, the absence of complaint. He had expected prison to produce rage, or at minimum the constant simmer of indignation that powerful men carry when stripped of their power. Instead, what it produced slowly and without announcement was something closer to silence, not peace, not acceptance, just the gradual quieting of a machine that had been running at full capacity for so long it had forgotten what idle felt like. His mother called every Sunday at 2 o'clock, which was the scheduled call window for his housing unit. She talked about her garden, about the neighbors, about a book she was reading, ordinary things delivered with the deliberate ordinariness of a woman who had decided that what her son needed was not sympathy or analysis, but the simple continuity of someone who still treated him like a person. He was grateful for that in a way he could not fully articulate. He told her so once awkwardly, mid-conversation, and she said, "Mark, I'm your mother. This is not exceptional. This is just Tuesday." And somehow that was the most comforting thing anyone had said to him in months. David Marsh called on the 6th week to report that Victor Salles had entered his own plea agreement, that Mark's cooperation credit had been formally logged, and that the supervised release conditions had been slightly modified in Mark's favor as a result. He delivered this news with the same professional efficiency he delivered everything, and Mark said thank you, and David said he was welcome. And they both understood that the relationship was concluding, that the legal machinery had done what it could, and what remained now was simply time. Richard Holt called once briefly to confirm that the divorce was fully finalized, that all asset distributions had been completed, and that there were no remaining civil matters requiring Mark's attention. He asked with the genuine, if somewhat formal, warmth of a man who had spent months adjacent to someone else's catastrophe whether Mark was doing all right. Mark said he was managing. Richard said that was probably the most honest answer available. They did not speak again after that. Jessica never called. Mark had not expected her to. He thought about her occasionally in the first month, not with longing, but with the detached curiosity of someone examining an artifact from an earlier period of life. He thought about the night they had spent together the last night, the night he had driven home from, in the belief that he was returning to a controlled world. He thought about the text he had sent her. She suspects nothing. She never will, and felt something he could only describe as the physical sensation of being wrong in a way that had no remedy. He did not think about her after the 2nd month. What he thought about with the frequency and focus that quiet institutional life provides for the thoughts you would prefer not to have was Elena. Not the Elena of the legal documents or the cooperating witness or the majority shareholder. The earlier one. The woman who had sat across from him at breakfast for 15 years and listened while he talked about his deals and his plans and his ambitions, and had never once, not once, told him that she was paying attention to something far more important than anything he was saying. He thought about the blue-flowered coffee mug from the Vermont Craft Fair. He thought about the chair by the window. He thought about her voice on the voicemail, calm, clear, unhurried, and the way it had sounded exactly the same as it always had, completely unaltered by everything she had been carrying in silence. He thought about the 3 sentences she had sent him by email. "I am not your enemy. I simply could not continue to be someone you didn't see." He turned those sentences over in the quiet of the library between returned books and the soft wheel sound of the cart, and each time he returned to them, they meant something slightly different and slightly more complete. By the end of the first year, he understood them in a way he had not been capable of understanding anything when he was living the life that had made them necessary. The first year passed the way the first year of any long, unwanted thing passes, with agonizing slowness in individual moments and surprising speed in retrospect. Seasons changed outside the windows of the facility. The library acquired new donations boxes of paperback novels, a set of outdated encyclopedias, 3 copies of a memoir by a former senator that no one checked out. Mark cataloged them all with the same methodical attention he had once applied to quarterly reports, because the work was there and doing it carefully was the only available form of dignity. He read more than he had read in 20 years. Not business literature, he had consumed enough of that to last several lifetimes and found it from his current position almost comically beside the point. He read novels, history, a biography of a 19th century railroad magnate that was either a cautionary tale or an admiring portrait depending on which chapter you were in and which Mark found himself reading as both simultaneously. He read a book about forgiveness, not a self-help book, but a philosophical one, dense and serious, and found that it did not resolve anything, but made the unresolved things feel less like failures and more like questions that simply required longer. He started writing in the second year. Nothing dramatic, not a memoir, not a confession, not the kind of self-justifying narrative that men in his position sometimes produce. Just notes, observations, the kind of honest internal accounting he had never done when he was too busy managing external ones. He wrote about the laugh in the car. He wrote about the text message. He wrote about the coffee mug and the chair by the window and the 31-minute drive he had made dozens of times, perfectly timed, believing himself clever and untouchable. He wrote about what it meant to be seen and what it meant to refuse to see. He was not sure the writing was good. He was sure it was honest, which was the only standard he had left. His mother visited 4 times during the 2 years and 4 months. She drove herself, which she was still capable of at 74, declining Mark's repeated suggestions that she take a car service. She sat across from him in the visitation room and talked with the same deliberate ordinariness of her Sunday calls, and sometimes she brought him a small thing, a photograph, a newspaper clipping about something neither of them had a stake in, just to have something tangible to pass across the table. On her 3rd visit, she brought a photograph of his childhood home in upstate New York. He looked at it for a long time. "Why this?" he asked. She said, "So you remember where you started, before everything got so complicated." He kept it in his housing unit, pressed between the pages of whatever book he was currently reading, moving it forward as he moved through books so that it traveled with him. 14 months in a corrections officer named Henderson, a quiet man in his 50s who ran the library schedule with the unhurried competence of someone who had been doing the same job well for a long time and found it sufficient, stopped by Mark's cart one afternoon and said without particular ceremony, "You're one of the few in here who actually puts things back in the right place." Mark said he had always been good with systems. Henderson considered this and said, "Systems are fine. It's the people inside them that get complicated." He moved on. Mark stood by his cart and thought about that sentence for the rest of the afternoon because it was the most accurate description of everything that had happened to him that he had heard from anyone anywhere in the entire preceding 14 months. 2 years and 4 months arrived with the same administrative neutrality with which they had begun. Release processing, a form, a date, a bag with the personal items that had been held in intake storage, a watch, a wallet containing $43, and a credit card that was certainly no longer active, a phone that was certainly dead. He signed the release paperwork, shook Henderson's hand, and walked through the intake exit in the same direction he had arrived, except this time the door opened outward instead of in. His mother was in this parking lot. She had driven herself, of course. She got out of the car when she saw him and walked to him with the direct, unhurried movement of a woman who had decided this was a moment that did not require elaborate staging. She hugged him properly with both arms for longer than a polite hug lasts and said nothing because nothing was needed. He held on for a moment that was longer than he had intended and found that he did not care. They drove back to her house in upstate New York. She had made dinner. They ate at the kitchen table, the same table he had eaten at as a child. Older now, the surface worn smooth in the particular way of furniture that has been used by the same family for decades. She served pot roast and did not ask him what his plans were because she had decided that the first night was not for plans. He was grateful for that, too. He stayed with her for 6 weeks while the supervised release conditions were established, and he navigated the practical mechanics of rebuilding a life from its most stripped-down components. He opened a new bank account with the settlement funds that had been held in a structured account during his incarceration, a number that would have seemed laughably small to the Mark Sterling of 2 years ago, and that felt to the Mark Sterling of today like more than enough to begin. He bought a used car. He found a small apartment in a mid-sized city 2 hours from Greenwich, far enough that the name Sterling did not carry its old weight close enough that his mother's Sunday calls arrived in the same time zone. He did not look for work in finance. He had thought about this carefully during the long library hours, and the conclusion he had reached was not self-pity or punishment, but simply accuracy. He was 54 years old. He had a federal fraud conviction on his record. The industry he had spent his career in would not have him back, and he had stopped believing he deserved it back, which were two different things that happened to arrive at the same destination. He found work instead as a financial literacy instructor at a community organization that offered free workshops to adults who had never been taught how to manage money. People who were not wealthy and had no interest in becoming wealthy, who simply wanted to understand the basic mechanics of the financial system well enough to live inside it without being destroyed by it. He was good at it. That surprised him less than it might have once. He had always been good at explaining complex systems in plain language. It had been one of his genuine skills beneath all the performance and the arrogance. Stripped of the performance, the skill remained. He sat across from people in a community center classroom 2 evenings a week and explained interest rates and credit scores and the basic architecture of a budget, and they listened, and some of them came back the following week, and some of those came back the week after that, and each time someone returned, he felt something that was small and real and entirely unlike anything the old life had produced. It was in the 15th month after his release, a Thursday evening in early spring, 2.5 years since the morning he had walked through the front door of the Greenwich estate and found an empty house and a sealed envelope, that Mark saw Elena for the first time since she had disappeared from his life. He was not looking for her. He was in his apartment eating dinner at the kitchen table with the television on in the background, something he did now, not because he was particularly interested in what was on, but because the sound made the apartment feel less quiet. A business news program he had half registered. He was reading something, not watching, when a name stopped him. Elena Sterling. He looked up. She was on the screen. Not in the context of any scandal or legal proceeding. Those had been processed and concluded and moved to the back pages of the trade publications long before Mark had been released. She was on the screen in the context of a business segment, the kind of segment that profiles executives who are doing something notable. The graphic beside her name read, Sterling Whitmore Global CEO, $200 million in annual revenue, offices in 4 countries. He put down his fork. She looked different, not dramatically different. Her face was the same face, but she held herself with a directness that he recognized in retrospect as something that had always been there and that he had simply never looked directly at. She sat in the interview chair with the relaxed, grounded confidence of someone who had been building toward exactly this moment for a very long time and was entirely unsurprised to have arrived. The interviewer, a woman who specialized in profiles of transformational business leaders, according to the lower third graphic, leaned forward and said, "You took over Whitmore Architecture Group under circumstances that were by any measure extraordinary. How do you characterize what you built from that starting point?" Elena considered the question for exactly the amount of time it took to give a considered answer, not a prepared one. "We inherited a structure that had significant strengths and some significant problems," she said. "We identified what was working, removed what wasn't, and built forward from what remained. That's essentially it." "The corporate scandal that preceded your formal leadership," the interviewer began. Elena's expression did not change. She did not tighten or deflect or shift. She simply said, "We cut out what no longer served the vision, and then we built something stronger." She said it with the same tone you would use to describe a straightforward business decision, which it had been, and the completeness of that framing the way it contained everything and explained nothing and required nothing was the most powerful thing Mark had heard in 2.5 years. He sat with the remote in his hand and did not change the channel. The interviewer moved on to questions about the company's international expansion, about Elena's leadership philosophy, about the team she had assembled. Elena answered each one with the same clear, unhurried directness. She mentioned at one point a partner, not a business partner, but the way she said it, and the way the interviewer responded with a knowing smile indicated something more. a man who appeared briefly in a photograph on the studio set behind her, Elena and someone else standing together at some kind of outdoor event, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. She did not introduce or explain the photograph. She did not need to. Mark looked at the photograph for the few seconds it was visible on screen. He felt something, not jealousy, not grief, not the complicated tangle of emotions he might have predicted if you had asked him to imagine this moment during those long library hours in Danbury. What he felt was simpler than any of that. He felt the truth of it, the absolute clean, uncomplicated truth that Elena Sterling had always been exactly who she was, that he had simply refused to see it, and that the world had not waited for him to begin understanding her before continuing to allow her to be remarkable. The segment ended. The interviewer thanked Elena. Elena thanked the interviewer with a warmth that was genuine and measured and gave away nothing she had not chosen to give. The screen moved on to the next story. Mark turned the television off. He sat in the quiet of his apartment for a long time. The spring evening was coming through the window. Not the institutional silence of the library, not the hollow silence of the Greenwich estate, but the ordinary ambient quiet of a regular evening in a regular apartment in a city that did not know his name and did not particularly need to. He thought about the interviewer's question, "How do you characterize what you built?" and about the answer Elena had given. "We cut out what no longer served the vision." He turned that sentence over the way he had turned over her email sentences in the library, finding new angles in it. She had said, "we," which was interesting. Not, "I removed him," or "I cut out the problem." We, as if the company had done it together, as if it had been a collective decision by something larger than any one person, which he supposed was true. He also noticed, and this was the thing that stayed with him longest, the thing that he carried from that evening forward into the continuing life he was building in this smaller, realer, more honest version of himself. She had never said his name. Not in the interview. Not in any of the coverage he had seen or heard. Not in the 3-sentence email she had sent him during the legal proceedings. In the public account of everything that had happened, Mark Sterling was a financial irregularity that had been resolved, a problem that had been removed, a chapter that had closed. He was not her villain. He was not her wound. He was not even her lesson, because Elena did not require his story to explain her success. She had simply moved forward as she had always planned to, and the space where he had been was not a scar. It was just cleared ground on which something better had been built. He picked up the notebook he kept on the kitchen table, not a legal document, not a financial record, just a regular composition notebook he had started after release, continuing the writing habit from Danbury, and he wrote one sentence. "She didn't need me to understand what I'd done. She just needed to be free of it." He looked at the sentence for a moment, then closed the notebook. He called his mother. She answered on the second ring. "Mark," she said, "it's Thursday. Everything all right?" "I saw Elena on television," he said. "A business segment. She's running Whitmore now, internationally." His mother was quiet for a moment. "How did she look?" "Like herself," he said. "Like who she always was." He paused. "I didn't know that when I was married to her. I think that's the most honest summary I have." His mother made the small sound again, the one that was not a judgment, just recognition. "What are you going to do with that?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. And he meant it without bitterness, without resignation, without any of the emotional colorings that nothing sometimes carries. He meant it as the simple, clean answer it was. "There's nothing to do with it. It's just true." "That's good, Mark," his mother said quietly. "That's actually good." They talked for a while longer about ordinary things, her garden, a book she was reading, whether he was eating properly, the workshop he had run on Tuesday that had gone well. He told her about a woman who had attended the workshop for the 3rd consecutive week and had finally understood compound interest in a way she hadn't before, and had said so with the particular brightness of someone receiving a tool they had always needed and never been given. His mother said that sounded like useful work. He said he thought it was. After the call ended, he sat for a while longer in the apartment that was small and real and entirely his own, and he did not think about the Greenwich estate or the $60,000 car or the morning he had driven home believing himself untouchable. He thought about Tuesday's workshop and the notebook on the table, and the photograph of his childhood home pressed between the pages of the book he was currently reading. He thought about the woman on the television screen, clear-eyed, direct, grounded building, something that did not require his participation or his understanding, or even his acknowledgement to be exactly what it was. He thought about Henderson in the library. Systems are fine. It's the people inside them that get complicated. He got up, washed his dinner dishes, and put them in the rack to dry with the careful attention to small tasks that he had learned in Danbury and had not unlearned since. He made a cup of coffee. He sat back down at the table with the notebook and opened it to a fresh page. He was not the man who had laughed in the rearview mirror on a September morning 2.5 years ago. That man had believed power was the ability to control everything around him and had discovered in the most complete and irrevocable way available that the things he had believed he controlled had never belonged to him at all. The company had always had Elena at its center. The marriage had always contained her full intelligence, directed quietly and precisely at a future he was too arrogant to see coming. The life he had believed was his had been in every meaningful sense built on the borrowed patience of a woman who had simply been waiting for the right moment to take it back. And Elena Sterling, standing in a studio running a company that spanned 4 countries, beside a partner who made her laugh at things outside the frame, had never once looked back. Not because she was cold, not because she was ruthless, but because there was nothing behind her worth the turn. That was not revenge. It was not triumph. It was simply what happens when a person who has been underestimated long enough finally stops waiting for recognition and begins quietly and completely and without apology to build the life that was always theirs to build. Mark Sterling, inmate number 4, 9201 workshop instructor. Notebook keeper, son of a woman who answered on the second ring, picked up his pen and began to write. He had a long way to go. He understood that now without bitterness as a simple and accurate fact. The road ahead was longer than the one behind, and smaller and more honest, and entirely his own to walk. That was enough. For the first time in his life, it was genuinely, completely enough.